This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Kathryn, and I are discussing unusual point of view narrator characters, and to start the discussion rolling, Kathryn's going to give us an example. So let me just turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I read a book. Surprising, I know. It was called In an Instant, and it's by Suzanne Redfearn, and I found it a very enjoyable read. And one of the reasons it was so enjoyable for me was because it had a very distinct point of view character who was different than I was used to reading. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the synopsis on Amazon so you guys can get an idea. It says, life is over in an instant for 16-year-old Finn Miller when a devastating car accident tumbles her and 10 others over the side of a mountain. Suspended between worlds, she watches helplessly as those she loves struggle to survive. So within the first act of the book, you meet Finn. They do a really good job of making you fall in love with her, and then, boom, she's dead. But you stick in this first-person point of view from her perspective as you watch her family struggling to escape the wreckage. They're in the middle of a snowstorm, and, people are dying, not just her, catastrophic injuries, and you're watching it from her perspective. So it made me start thinking about the tools that gave the author, because you're watching it from a character who's just an observer. So as the book goes along, you watch her as a character evolve into a better and better observer. She starts with kind of these set ideas of what her parents or her siblings are, and then as she watches them from a point that maybe they wouldn't have been comfortable with her watching them before, she starts having different empathy for them or different compassion. Meanwhile, we're watching their journey. So it's like she's a fully developed character. She has a full point of view, but we're watching the story of her mother's development or her sister's recovery or her father's recovery from this accident, which I found really interesting and fascinating. And as a writer, it made me go, would I ever want to do something like that? And what kind of did that give the author that maybe a different point of view wouldn't have,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I've got a few different thoughts to kind of start us down the road of writers' tools. So first, let's just remind everyone of the cardinal rule, which is you can do anything so long as you do it well, right? So even though I'm going to talk like get a little into lit theory and kind of best practices here, keep in mind the umbrella rule is you can still do anything you want. So first we've got a narrator witness, but what's really interesting, the twist here is that unlike a narrator witness like Nick Carraway in Great Gatsby, this character ceases to be the protagonist when she dies. So she's now just a narrator witness. So she sort of crossed the threshold from being protagonist narrator witness to being an essayist narrator. An essayist narrator is a lit theory term, which basically means we've got a narrator who's a storyteller. So instead of being an invisible authorial narrator that we as readers are unaware of, that we just, accept as part of the convention of reading, we have a persona speaking to us, telling us this story. And so then that kind of narrator is allowed to have biases and, perspective, a specific take on a situation. There is no neutrality needed with that kind of storyteller, essayist, narrator, which is an interesting craft twist. I like that. And then the third kind of point of view thing that's happening here, and I haven't read it, so you can confirm or deny this, Kathryn, but by being dead, she becomes omniscient. So maybe she doesn't go into the other characters' heads the way an omniscient authorial narrator does, but she certainly sees all. right? She is privy to things that she wouldn't be if she were in a body. So that's certainly a cool narrative situation that author created.
Well, and that gives you the choice, right? You could say, okay, I want her to be omniscient. I want her to have, and maybe that creates an issue where your narrator has too much information overload. Like, I can hear thoughts, and I can hear, and I can see this, and I can see that. Or like Suzanne Redfearn did, she just chose, she's an observer, but she gets to go into the private moments, right? That maybe you wouldn't be able to as a human observer or witness, but she still didn't hear thoughts or, invade dreams or anything like that. So you kind of have that choice though, right? Like where that layer is for your observer point of view.
So she's a fly on the wall observer. Is that how you describe it? Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
And what sort of character arc does she then experience after the transition to becoming a ghost? Is there any, for a start, I suppose?
I would say that this particular character did have one. I do wonder if you have to have one for a narrator like that.
You do for a protagonist. You don't for just the storyteller narrator. So then that would be a choice this author would have to make. Is the ghost character going to remain the protagonist? Like Nick Carraway is the protagonist, not Gatsby or Daisy, because Nick has the change. He has the character arc and the transformation. Gatsby dies and Daisy stays with her husband and doesn't grow or evolve as a result of what happened. So I would put the same framework around this other narrative situation and say, does this character, once dead, now narrator, continue to evolve? And is she functioning as a protagonist, or is she only functioning as a witness narrator, as the fly on the wall?
Right. And I think that she definitely functions as the fly on the wall, and the change that she has is much more of like a character thing, not so much a plot arc, not so much a character arc in full, but more like something you'd see in a secondary character that had like a minor influential change, but not something crazy. Her mom and her sister and her father are definitely the ones that undergo the transformation because of the accident, which is another question. Like, because you have this fly on the wall point of view, it changed the protagonist structure, right? So now she's observing all of these people. It would be hard for me to pick out one that I thought was maybe more heavily weighted protagonist than the other.
So did the point of view character shift, when she kind of passed the baton at death from being the protagonist to her family members being the protagonists of the plot? Did we enter anyone else's perspective as a point of view character? So it was only her point of view throughout.
Yes.
Interesting.
And she supposes emotions and she observes emotions or reactions, but she is very clear about the fact that she's guessing, right? So there's that filter there that she's definitely not like, my mom felt this. It's, I watched her do this, which made me think she felt this, right? And so it's that very definite, limited point of view.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Huh. So what do you think made this effective? You said you found it a very enjoyable read. What kept the story from falling apart when the author started doing all of these unusual point of view things?
I think it's because the story itself is a multi-person story, right? It's a tragedy. It's a family tragedy. They lose one daughter, and then over the course, I don't want to like give any crazy spoilers or whatever, but it's a lot of recovery, right? So they've had a tragedy, and it's the family trying to figure out how to move on. And I think if they had just picked one person to try and observe that from, you would have missed a lot of nuance of kind of the overall tragedy and like people making choices. Why did they make the choices that they made? That's kind of definitely the thematic view of the book, right? Was what choices did you make in the middle of the tragedy? How did that affect the outcome? Do you have regret? Do you have grief, guilt, like where are those choices leading you? So I think this perspective may have been the only one to get at the larger overall tragedy, right? Otherwise, you're dealing with one specific person's reaction to events rather than multiple. And it did, I don't know if, did anybody, I think it was based on a book. Sorry. Start sentences, finish sentences, Kathryn. If I Stay. Did anybody watch that movie? Or I think it was based on a book.
No.
Yes, I've read the book, yeah.
Yeah, so that was a similar kind of a situation where the girl, again, dies in a tragedy and she's watching her family and she wants so desperately to interact. But, I don't remember exactly. It's been a while since I watched it. But it kind of gave me that same vibe. It's like, it's leading to a feel-good ending, but in the middle it's so dark. And you got to kind of have that break between family members, see how she's doing, see how she's doing, see how he's doing, to kind of lead you along. Different people are in different stages of the grief process. They're in different stages of recovery. So it keeps it out of that like super dark, I think. So, yeah.
Something I like about what you were describing is that by having this narrator dead and giving her this supernatural ability to be the fly on the wall for each of the other characters, then you get to have the experience of the multiple characters in their multiple places in the story without giving everybody a point of view and developing that ensemble cast, which keeps your point of view and your narrative tight. It keeps it, singular as a single through line, but it's still, through that kind of sleight of hand of making her a ghost, lets you visit everybody and have all of those different takes on the situation. I mean, I don't want to say lens because I always use lens to talk about through the point of view character's eyes, but
Yeah, it gives you that, and it also gives you a way of structuring the story, right? Because Finn, the point of view character, she only knows what she's seen so far. So like if she's been watching her mom, she sees what her mom's going through. And so you can craft the tension of what's going on over here, and what's happened in her absence with that structure that you couldn't do, I don't think, as well with multiple point of views, because you'd kind of be in that character's head and know what they were planning or what they were thinking. You only get the observation here of Finn. So I think it gives you more freedom to have that, like, I'm only showing you this reader,
Right.
What else is going on over here? A little more tension and a little more, invisible motives for the characters, right? So, which I think worked really, really well in this, because you're watching them heal, but you aren't hearing them heal. So you don't know what's going on in their brain.
Right. And often when people do too many points of view in a multiple POV story, the pitfall they encounter is that they are giving the reader too much information, and so the tension is actually reduced. It works against them, So by keeping to the observation, right, to only what the narrator / point of view character can show us or reveal to us, then you avoid that pitfall of just spoiling everything by making it all obvious, making it all revealed.
One more question about the POV character here. Finn definitely had stakes, right? She had at stake, this is her family, and she cared very deeply about what happened to them. But I wonder, what that tie between stakes and POV is. When you have this fly on the wall character, how closely tied to those people and their story does it need to be?
I'm not sure there is a need to be answered, but it, we're so used to a storyteller narrator as being kind of a colorful character weaving the tale for us. And it's unusual to have the storyteller narrator who's actually got some kind of skin in the game, but isn't an active player in the plot. So that's another kind of clever change that this author made to the narrative style. And I think it keeps us engaged with Finn, as opposed to Finn kind of disappearing in the background
Right.
and just being the idea of the storyteller. Finn remains a character in our minds and in our hearts because Finn is the perspective lens on the action. And so through Finn's caring, Finn's investment, and what happens to the players in the plot, we maintain the strength of that caring and connection more so than if we were only observing the family, without that kind of depth of feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're connected to the family through Finn rather than just watching or observing a family that you don't have any personal connection to.
Right. Or through giving all of the family points of view or passing the point of view baton to a different character. So, yeah, really interesting.
I think it would have been
choices.
really easy. Yeah, and I think it would have been really easy to be judgmental of other characters if you had multiple point of views or if you were in one of the recovering characters' point of views, because they would have seen like a different person's way of handling grief differently, right? They would have, maybe judged it differently than like Finn as an observer. Just she kind of has more compassion or more empathy toward each person's process and what they're doing, which I think worked really well for this particular narrative. So
Right. And it makes me think, being a little philosophical here, that, Finn, as the dead person, her pain is over, right? But her family who's grieving, they're all in pain. So their versions of pain are like butting up against each other. So you can expect misunderstandings or conflict or, missed opportunities to comfort each other or whatever. Whereas Finn, not being in a state of pain, can bring that compassion you mentioned to each of the characters that they can't bring to each other. And then that's also going to deepen the reader's empathy for these characters without us needing to give them all those point of view lenses on their experience.
cool.
Definitely presents a lot of challenges, doesn't it? Because as you've both been talking, I've been thinking about, for example, agency. So, where does agency fit into that, where your main character now apparently really has none in the sense of influence over the story? So how would you treat that first? I guess that's the question for you, Alida, really is.
Are you ready to take your storycraft to the next level? StoryWorks Fiction Online School has courses available right now, from micro courses on character traits to master level workshops on plot and building characters. There are also live workshops with your instructor in the classroom with you every week, guiding your progress and workshopping your manuscripts along the way. All students enrolled in StoryWorks Fiction, whether active in a class or not, can take advantage of the monthly free live Q&A calls with Alida. Check out storyworksfiction.com today and take your storycraft to the next level.
Where would agency fit in there?
Yeah, I think in this particular example, the agency would be passed to the players in the plot, right, because Finn is really in the role of narrator at this point, but she's got that funny dual role of being the POV character as storyteller narrator who has lost the role of protagonist, right? So she is still the POV character, but she's no longer the protagonist, the one with the agency moving the plot forward, right? So it's kind of a unique situation. I've never heard of another point of view narrative taking this shape before. So if there's a second one, let us know. Put it in the comments, send me an email.
I've not come across one that shifts. While you were talking, I looked up If I Stay, and she's in a terrible accident and goes into a coma, and then her stakes are, does she, literally as per the title, does she decide to relinquish the real world and let go because she doesn't believe there's anything worth living for, or does she stay? And of course, that's the quandary of the movie and the book.
Right.
So that's always playing through, and her observations of other characters involved, some who really, really care, some who have got agendas she never realised, and all that sort of stuff. Definitely influence her decisions. So her agency, I suppose, is still rests with her in terms of should she let go or come back. I did read I may have even mentioned this quite a while ago on the podcast. I read a book where the point of view was from the house that all the occupants are in, and it was a story of some terrible abuse. And that was interesting. I wouldn't necessarily say that it was a terrific story, but obviously it was terrific enough that it stayed with me and I finished the book. So it was a tough call. And the house, from memory, I think maybe had some sense of agency. Maybe it could just feel differently to the different occupants. Perhaps, there was, you walk into certain places and they feel ominous or they feel welcoming. Maybe it had some limited agency in that respect. But
yeah, I think that, and I haven't read that book either, but it sounds to me like that's a case of the setting becoming a character, and that writer took it to the next step of making that character the narrator, but it's still definitely a narrator, witness, a storyteller, narrator, where we can have the bias and the, sense of emotion or personality coming through, but we aren't getting a protagonist from the house, right? Because the house can't advance the plot. Whereas in this book, in an instant, you do have a protagonist who then, it shifts. Right. The narrative changes and the protagonist role changes, but the point of view character does not, which is interesting.
Yeah, I suppose in a way it's like a protagonist who you could argue that the inciting instant is they lose their agency. And at the same time become purely the narrator. So maybe like somebody who falls into a well and is awaiting rescue and is injured. They have no agency other than their own thoughts. The other thing that came to mind was Castaway, but in Castaway he definitely has agency over his territory. So I suppose person against nature.
Right.
You still got a protagonist who has to survive, whereas in Kathryn's example, she doesn't have to survive.
Right.
No, she can't. There's literally no survival.
Yes, and we will never forget Tom Hanks knocking out a tooth with a ice skate blade, right? There's some definite moments there. Yes. Anyway, sorry, Castaway just sent me to another place momentarily.
I was just trying to think of stories where you've only got the one character and no others who can interact with them. And it's a similar example, but clearly it's not the same because, as you've said very well, Alida, you've got a protagonist with agency right up until a certain point, and then they become the narrator. So it's really two stories, I guess, in a way that's set in an overarching theme of education or worldview.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the cool thing for me was the thematic part of the book came through so strongly because of the choice of point of view. And I think that's something that as a writer, I don't necessarily think I've thought that hard about when I'm thinking about my point of view. I more think of who has the agency, who has the stakes, who has, but I don't necessarily think, okay, what's my theme? How could my point of view character best narrate that to the, oh, okay. And that was a very distinct example to me of where the theme came through very strong. It was not preachy, but it was very much a thematic book. And I think mostly because of the point of view and the narration. So again, just another thing that craft-wise you can take some time and think about and, maybe come up with something that was surprising the way that it came out. But, it's part of what made it such an enjoyable book. So
Right. As you were just talking about theme, it reminded me of Tara Westover's memoir, Educated. And it's a family drama, but it's also her journey, from that family to independence through an education. But there's so many scenes where she's talking about things that happen to family members and even things where she wasn't there. So she's kind of recreating the scene from what she was told. And she'll put in footnotes saying, so-and-so told me the story this way and so-and-so told me the story that way. And this is like my best guess at the recreation. And thinking about the narrator of In an Instant, it's kind of like this perspective of the memoirist telling a family drama with a cast of characters with a lot of different stories that touch on her own, and having that job of being the witness to these other pieces of the puzzle. That's maybe something else for people to draw on when you're thinking about that kind of, how do I bring in other pieces of a puzzle when they aren't from my protagonist perspective? How do I get these elements to come together? I don't know, just reminded me.
Yeah, that's a really, really good parallel to draw, though, because memoir is probably the closest thing to that latter half of that book, I guess, really, in terms of, although we can argue that this is a direct observational, so it's not even from memory,
right?
Which is really interesting. And I think if you're considering a premise like that, you'd have to, for that theme, it would be interesting then to consider what different POVs, in terms of the way the story is told, how it would eventuate. And kudos to this author for putting that off, because I don't think I would have dared try that. I would have scared it would become really boring, because I'm used to protagonists who are placed in situations of conflict.
Right.
So all of a sudden she's helpless to influence.
I wonder how many, she conceived of writing this point of view, if she set herself that challenge, or if she started telling this family drama story and, drafted this POV and that POV and tried this and tried that, and then finally landed on, okay, the most effective way to get this out there is through, the ghost of one of the protagonists. That's interesting.
And I would, there's actually an author's note in the back of the book where she talks about how it was based on her own kind of a very minor version of that experience herself, where she got trapped in a snowstorm as a kid, and how family and family friends reacted. And so it was like, definitely, I think she conceived of the story first. And so then it's like that tinker.
Yes.
Which point of view do I really need for this to come across? So
interesting.
And question for you, Kathryn: how attached were you to the other characters before the initial main character became the ghost?
Good question. Yeah. So I would say that after the incident where the main character becomes the ghost, I think her mom, her best friend, her dad, and her sister become kind of the four quadrants of the protagonist story, right? And before her death, mom was enemy number one. So you kind of hated her. Yeah. Dad was lucky, happy-go-lucky dad, buddy dad. Her best friend was definitely the one that you were the most attached to. And her sister was rebel without a cause. So they were very stereotypical, very clear, right? And you very much were like, okay, I got this nailed, right? But then when she pulls out, all of a sudden everybody becomes more nuanced. Yeah. So it was cool because throughout the book, you kind of learned more and more and more until they became fully round people. Whereas at the beginning, all you had was Finn's very limited perspective. Nice. Then she gets to see them growing in her own mind and memory as you go through. So, yeah, it was well done.
Yeah.
So there's an internal arc for the what has become the narrator now, then, because it's become. She's advanced her worldview that was limited before, and now has expanded those characters. So there's a lot of things to weave through there, isn't there?
Yeah, that reminds me of how when you're a child, you look at your parents and they're just your parent, right? And then you grow up and you're like, oh, wait a minute, mom and dad are people? They have lives, really?
They have
and they're idiots.
Yes. Oh, you mean I wasn't Princess Charming when I was a teenager?
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. Oops. And you get to root for them differently kind of through the book because of that. So, yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, I want to throw out, because Robert, you mentioned Castaway and having a single character on the page, that in the second episode of the Storyworks reading series, our new sister podcast, S.A. Walter reads Black Bart, which is a single character on the page. And then in our discussion following, we talk about that and maintaining tension and what it was like for her to craft that and how many revisions it took. So let me just refer people back to reading series episode 2.
I love the title.
Yeah, it is a great title. It's a great story. So, any final thoughts on this particular narrative choice? I think a bunch of people are going to be going out to pick up that book now. If you're listening to this podcast, you are probably a writer, and you've maybe heard me talk about the Storyworks reading series. It is the new branch in the Storyworks family tree. It is a literary journal podcast. That's right, a hybrid, a literary journal for your ears, with a print anthology at the end of the year of the best of the podcast. I am open for submissions, and I want to see your best prose right now. I am taking both fiction and creative nonfiction. You can read the guidelines and submit your work at storyworkspodcast.com/submit. What are you waiting for? It's time to see your stories published and sit on the other side of this microphone from me. Have a conversation about your storycraft. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.